The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating Carol's face twisted in fury as she jimmied the lock on Jake's back gate. "This property ends at the fence line," she hissed into her phone, "and I'm going to prove it." The gate swung open. She stepped into the overgrown yard, designer heels sinking into soft earth. One more step. Two. Then nothing. The ground gave way beneath her feet, and her scream echoed from somewhere impossibly deep as her phone tumbled after her, its light spiraling down, down, down into the earth, revealing moss-covered stones from another century before everything went black. Above ground, Jake's security camera captured it all, the timestamp reading 11:47 p.m., and in the morning her Mercedes would still be running in his driveway, driver's door open, engine humming, her absence like a question mark hanging in the suburban air. Part 1. The invasion. Jake Morrison had been in his house exactly 3 weeks when he met Carol Weinstein for the first time. She appeared at his front door on a Tuesday morning like a storm cloud that had learned to wear Lululemon and carry a leather-bound binder. "The new owner," she said, not a question. A statement delivered with the kind of certainty that suggested she'd already decided everything important about him. Jake, still in his paint-stained t-shirt from refinishing the kitchen cabinets, managed a tired smile. "Jake Morrison, just moved in from Portland. You must be Carol Weinstein, HOA president. Maple Ridge Estates." She thrust the binder at him with both hands like a priest offering a sacred text. "Everything you need to know is in here. Meeting schedule, architectural guidelines, lawn maintenance standards, acceptable paint colors, fence regulations, tree trimming protocols." Jake took the binder, surprised by its weight. It had to be 3 inches thick. "This is comprehensive. Maintain standards here, Mr. Morrison." Her eyes scanned his front yard with the intensity of a health inspector in a restaurant kitchen. "I notice your grass is approaching 4 inches. The maximum allowable height is 3.5. He blinked. "I've been here 3 weeks. I've been focused on the inside. The outside is what your neighbors see, what affects property values, what reflects on the entire community." She pointed to a dandelion near his mailbox like she was identifying a crime scene. "That needs to be addressed. We don't allow invasive species. It's a dandelion. It's a violation." She made a note on her phone. "I'll expect compliance by this weekend. Now about your backyard." Jake felt his jaw tight. "What about it?" "I need to inspect it. There have been concerns." "Concerns from who? I haven't even met anyone else yet." Carol's smile was the kind that never reached the eyes. "I have access to historical property surveys. Your lot is one of the larger ones in the development, and there's been some question about whether the previous owner may have encroached on community common space when they installed their fence. The fence has been there for 30 years, according to the disclosure documents. 30 years of potential encroachment. I'll need to verify the actual property lines. I'm sure you understand." Jake understood that he was dealing with exactly the kind of person his realtor had warned him about. "Every neighborhood has one," she'd said. "That person who treats the HOA like their personal fiefdom." He thought she was exaggerating. "Survey was done when I bought the place 2 months ago," Jake said. "Everything checked out. Like to see it for myself. Thursday at 2 p.m. works for me." "Thursday doesn't work for me. I have a work call." Carol's expression hardened. "Friday then, 10 a.m. I'll see myself through the side gate." "Actually, I'd prefer to be present if you're—" But she was already walking away, heels clicking on his driveway, phone already to her ear. Jake watched her climb into a white Mercedes SUV with a personalized plate that read Standard. The irony was apparently lost on her. He stood in his doorway, binder in hand, feeling like he'd just been mugged by someone who'd paid $200 for a yoga session that morning. Welcome to the neighborhood. The side gate was open when Jake got home from the hardware store on Thursday afternoon. He froze in his driveway, bags of concrete and lumber supplies in his truck bed. The gate he'd specifically locked that morning was standing wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Jake's backyard was his sanctuary. One of the main reasons he'd bought this particular house was the privacy, nearly a quarter acre that backed up to old-growth woods, surrounded by a weathered cedar fence that created a perfect barrier from the cookie-cutter suburban sprawl. The previous owner had been a botanist, and the yard was a wild tangle of native plants, overgrown flower beds, and a magnificent oak tree that had to be at least 100 years old. He walked around the side of the house and stopped dead. Carol Weinstein was in his backyard, tape measure in hand, making notes on a tablet. She trampled through his late wife's, wildflower garden that he hadn't had the heart to change yet. The purple coneflowers and black-eyed Susans were crushed under her designer sneakers. "What the hell are you doing?" She looked up without a trace of embarrassment. "Your fence is definitely encroaching. I'm documenting it." "I didn't give you permission to be here." HOA Bylaws, Section 7, Paragraph 3. The board has the right to inspect properties for covenant violations. That requires 24-hour notice and the homeowner's consent. I left you a voicemail Tuesday, saying you were coming Friday. Tomorrow, this is Thursday. Carol waved her hand dismissively. I'm here now, might as well get it done. Your fence is 6 inches over the property line on the eastern boundary. It'll need to be removed and rebuilt. Jake felt heat rising up his neck. The survey I had done 3 months ago says otherwise. Then your surveyor was incompetent. I've been on this board for 8 years, Mr. Morrison. I know these properties. Out of my yard, she looked at him with something like pity. There's no need to be hostile. I'm trying to help you avoid a costly legal battle. The HOA could sue you for the encroachment. Out now. Carol's expression shifted to something colder. I'll be filing a formal complaint. You have 30 days to remove the fence, or we'll proceed with legal action. You'll also need to address these weeds masquerading as a garden, this unmowed lawn, and that oak tree is within 15 feet of the property line, which violates our sightline ordinances. Jake's hands clenched into fists. That oak tree was older than the entire development, older than the suburb itself. It had probably been a sapling when this land was still farmland. That tree was here before your HOA even existed. Grandfathering clauses expired in 2018. The tree presents a liability. It'll need to come down. Absolutely not. Then you'll be fined $500 per month until compliance. The fines can be placed as a lien on your property. She walked past him, shoulder deliberately bumping his. Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Morrison. I suggest you read that binder. Jake spent that evening on the phone with a property lawyer who quoted him $5,000 just to fight the HOA's demands. The lawyer sounded tired, like he'd had this conversation 1,000 times before. These neighborhood associations can be brutal, he said. Technically, you can fight it, but they have deeper pockets than you do. They can drag this out for years, and the legal fees will exceed the cost of just moving the fence. It's not about the fence, Jake said. It's about the principle. And the tree, she wants me to cut down a 100-year-old oak tree. The tree actually violating their covenants. Jake pulled up the HOA documents on his laptop, scanning through pages of dense legalese. There it was, buried in subsection 14.7. No trees exceeding 20 feet in height shall be maintained within 15 feet of any property boundary line. How is that even legal? Jake asked. Did you review the HOA covenants before you bought? Jake had, sort of. He'd skimmed them. There'd been so much paperwork during the purchase, so much to handle while still processing grief, still figuring out how to exist in a world without Sarah. The house had felt right, and he'd needed something to feel right. I didn't think, he trailed off. Most people don't. Look, my advice, try to work something out with the board president. People like this usually just want to feel important. Apologize, defer to their authority, maybe they'll back off. Jake thanked him and hung up. Then he went out to his backyard and sat under the oak tree, looking up through its branches at the stars appearing in the darkening sky. Sarah had loved trees. On their first date, they'd gotten lost hiking in Forest Park, and she'd identified every species they passed, telling him about their medicinal properties, their ecological roles, their secret lives that happened too slowly for humans to perceive. Trees are the elders, she'd said, touching the bark of a Douglas fir with reverence. They were here before us and they'll be here after. We're just temporary guests. Oak tree above him creaked in the wind and Jake made his decision. The first rock came through his front window on Saturday morning. Jake was making coffee when he heard the crash, the sound of glass exploding across his hardwood floor. He ran to the living room to find a chunk of landscaping stone sitting in a pile of glittering shards, wrapped in a note. Remove the fence. Remove the tree. This is your final warning. No signature, but Jake didn't need one. He called the police, who came out, took a report, and basically told him they couldn't do anything without proof. The officer, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, glanced at the HOA binder on his coffee table. Ridge Estates, she said. Yeah, we get calls from there a lot. Mostly neighbor disputes. These associations bring out the worst in people. She handed him a card. File for a restraining order if you have evidence of who did it. Otherwise, get security cameras. Good ones. Jake spent the rest of the day cleaning up glass and installing a comprehensive security system. 4 cameras covering every angle of his property, motion sensors, the works. He felt ridiculous doing it, like he was preparing for a siege in the suburbs. But the feeling of violation was too strong to ignore. The cameras went live at 6 p.m. AT 11:30 p.m. His phone buzzed with a motion alert from the backyard camera. Jake pulled up the feed and watched in real time as Carol Weinstein, dressed in black athletic wear like some kind of suburban ninja, climbed over his fence. She had a measuring tape and what looked like surveying equipment. She was in his yard in the middle of the night, moving through the shadows toward the oak tree. Jake was out the back door in seconds. but by the time he reached the tree, she was gone. He heard his side gate slam, then the sound of a car engine starting in the street behind his house. The next morning, he found orange spray paint on the oak's trunk, marked for removal, with measurements and coordinates noted on the bark like graffiti. The HOA meeting was in Carol's living room, which should have been Jake's first clue that this was going to be a theatrical production rather than a legitimate proceeding. 12 people sat on Carol's cream-colored sectional drinking coffee from matching cups, while Carol stood at a whiteboard like a corporate executive delivering bad news to shareholders. She'd prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled The Morrison Property, a comprehensive assessment of violations. Jake sat in a folding chair that had clearly been placed separately from the group, the defendant's chair. He'd brought his own documentation, the professional survey, photos of the fence from county records dating back 30 years, a letter from the Historical Society identifying the oak tree as a landmark specimen of significant ecological and historical value. None of it mattered. Carol clicked through slides showing his yard from various angles, each photo annotated with arrows and circles highlighting violations. The grass length, the wildflowers' uncontrolled vegetation, the oak tree, hazardous overgrowth, the fence, illegal encroachment. She'd even photographed a bird's nest in one of the oak's branches and labeled it wildlife attraction creating unsanitary conditions. Morrison property represents everything this community has fought against, Carol said, gesturing to the screen. Neglect, disregard for our standards, a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be part of Maple Ridge Estates. An elderly man raised his hand. Carol, I grew up in this area. That oak tree was there when all this land was Hendrickson's dairy farm. It's a piece of history. History doesn't pay our property values, Richard. Standards do. A younger woman spoke up. The fence looks fine to me. My survey from when I bought showed the same boundaries Jake's does. Your surveyor was clearly using outdated maps, Carol said smoothly. I've hired a professional to resurvey the entire eastern property line. The results will be available next week, but preliminary findings confirm my assessment. Jake stood up. You hired your own surveyor. With what authority? With the authority granted to me as HOA president. The cost will be divided among all homeowners. You can't just... I can. I did. Now we're voting on formal violation notices. All in favor. Hands went up. Not all of them. Richard and the young woman abstained, but enough. More than enough. Motion carries. Mr. Morrison, you have 30 days to comply with all violations or face daily fines of $500 and potential legal action. Carol smiled. This meeting is adjourned. Please help yourself to refreshments. Jake walked out into the perfect suburban evening, past the perfect lawns and perfect flower beds, and felt like he was trapped in a nightmare where everyone was smiling while they slowly crushed him. The harassment escalated over the next 2 weeks. Someone, definitely Carol, though he couldn't prove it, filed a complaint with the county claiming his oak tree was diseased and posed a safety hazard. The county sent an arborist who examined the tree and declared it in perfect health, but the visit cost Jake a $500 inspection fee. His trash cans were knocked over every collection day, garbage strewn across his lawn before he woke up. Someone egged his truck. He received anonymous letters, each more threatening than the last, all demanding he comply with the HOA or face consequences. Security cameras caught Carol in his backyard 3 more times. Once at 2 a.m., once at dawn, once during his work hours when she presumably thought he wasn't home. Each time she was measuring, documenting, marking. She'd started a campaign of photographic evidence, posting pictures of his property on the neighborhood Facebook page with captions like, "This is what happens when standards slip, and one bad apple spoils the barrel." Jake filed for a restraining order. The judge denied it. HOA disputes are civil matters, she said. Unless there's evidence of direct threats or violence, this court can't intervene in what appears to be a contractual disagreement between a homeowner and their association. Jake tried reasoning with Carol one final time. He caught her at her car one evening, held up his hands in surrender. "What do you want?" he asked. "Really, what would make you stop?" She looked at him with genuine confusion, as if he'd asked her why water was wet. "I want you to follow the rules, Mr. Morrison. The same rules everyone else follows. I want you to understand that you're not special, that your individual desires don't supersede the collective good of this community. It's a tree, Carol, just a tree," she said, and for the first time he saw something like passion in her eyes. "It's about order, control, making sure everything is exactly as it should be. Your tree, your fence, your weeds, they're chaos, and I don't allow chaos in my neighborhood." Neighborhood. You don't own? I've been here 12 years. I've watched this community grow. I've maintained its standards when others wanted to let things slide. I fought to keep property values high, to keep the wrong element out, to preserve what makes Maple Ridge special. So yes, Mr. Morrison, my neighborhood." She drove away, leaving Jake standing in the street, finally understanding that this was never about property lines or oak trees. This was about power. About a woman who'd found the one place in her life where she could be queen, and anyone who didn't bow was an enemy. Jake started digging on a Friday evening, not to remove the fence or cut down the tree, to understand his property. The house dated back to 1923, originally part of a much larger estate. The development had been built around it in the 1980s, and his lot was the original homestead. He'd found old county records showing that there'd been a well on the property, hand-dug sometime in the 1800s, that had been capped and buried when city water lines came through. He wanted to find it. Partly for historical interest, partly because anything that predated the HOA felt like evidence that his land had a life before Carol Weinstein decided she owned it. He used old survey maps and ground-penetrating radar equipment he rented from a local university. The well was supposedly near the oak tree, probably filled in, probably nothing but a curiosity. He found it on Sunday afternoon. The ground-penetrating radar showed a circular void about 30 feet from the oak, partially collapsed, depth uncertain. The old well exactly where the 1890s property map said it would be. Jake carefully dug down through decades of soil and found the original stone rim about 2 feet below the surface, covered by rotted boards and a rusted metal plate. He cleared away the debris and shone a flashlight down into the darkness. The well shaft dropped straight down, at least 20 feet, possibly more. The stones were ancient, hand-cut, fit together with amazing precision. A piece of history literally buried in his backyard. Jake put up temporary barriers around the well, orange construction cones and yellow caution tape, and made a note to call a historical preservation society in the morning. This was significant. Wells like this were rare, usually destroyed during development. The fact that it had survived, hidden, was remarkable. He went to bed that night feeling like he'd discovered something important, a connection to the past that predated HOA bylaws and property disputes, and Carol Weinstein's need for control. He had no idea that the well was about to solve all his problems in the most terrible way possible. The motion alert went off at 11:47 p.m. Jake was half asleep, phone buzzing on his nightstand. He pulled up the camera feed, expecting to see a raccoon or a deer. They'd been setting off the sensors regularly. Instead, he saw Carol Weinstein. She was dressed in black again, carrying a flashlight and bolt cutters. She cut through his gate lock. He heard the metal snap even through the phone's speaker and pushed the gate open. She stood in his backyard, looking around like a general surveying enemy territory. Jake watched, paralyzed, as she walked directly toward the oak tree, stepping over his wife's garden, through the native plants, purpose in every stride. She didn't see the caution tape until it was too late. The well opening was covered by the rotted boards Jake had pulled aside and temporarily placed back over the hole. Not secured, just resting there to prevent accidents until he could properly cap it. He'd meant to do it that afternoon, but had gotten distracted by a work call. Carol stepped directly onto the boards. For a fraction of a second, they held. Jake saw her realize something was wrong, saw her arms windmill for balance, saw her mouth open. Then the boards gave way with a crack like gunfire. She fell. The scream that came up from the well was primal, echoing, and then cut off abruptly with a sound Jake would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The wet final thud of a body hitting stone 20 feet down, then silence. Jake was running before his brain caught up with his body. Down the stairs, out the back door, across the yard. He reached the well and looked down into absolute darkness. "Carol, Carol, can you hear me?" Nothing. He grabbed his phone, dialed 911, and while it rang, shone his flashlight into the well shaft. She was at the bottom, twisted at an impossible angle, her designer athletic wear soaked in blood that looked black in the LED light. Her neck was bent wrong. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. 911, what's your emergency? Jake's voice came out strangled. There's been an accident. A woman fell into a well in my backyard. She's not moving. I think she's dead. She breathing? I can't tell. She's 20 feet down. Please just send someone. Send everyone. Ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. The fire department in 9. The police in 12. They had to rig a harness system to extract her, and by the time they brought Carol Weinstein's body up from that ancient well, the entire neighborhood was awake, gathered in Jake's backyard, watching in horrified silence. The paramedics tried to revive her. Jake knew it was performative. He'd seen her neck, the angle of her spine, the amount of blood, but they tried anyway because that's what you do. After 10 minutes, they stopped. Time of death, 12:14 a.m., one of them said quietly. The police separated Jake from the crowd, took him inside his house. A detective named Rodriguez sat across from him at the kitchen table, notebook out. Walk me through what happened. Jake told him everything. The HOA disputes, Carol's repeated trespassing, the security footage, the well he'd uncovered, the boards he'd temporarily placed over it. His voice sounded mechanical in his own ears. Rodriguez wrote it all down. You have video of her entering your property? All of it, weeks of footage. Need to see that. They watched the recordings together, Carol climbing the fence, Carol spray painting the tree, Carol cutting the lock, Carol walking toward the well, stepping on the boards, falling. The footage was crystal clear, HD video with night vision and timestamps. Rodriguez was quiet for a long time. This is going to sound like a strange question, Mr. Morrison, but did you want her dead? Jake looked at him. No, God, no, I wanted her to leave me alone. I wanted to keep my tree and live in my house in peace. I never wanted that. Well, why didn't you have it properly secured? I found it 2 days ago. I was planning to call a preservation society, get it properly capped. The boards were just temporary. I didn't think. Jake's voice broke. I didn't think anyone would be in my backyard at midnight. Was trespassing. Rodriguez closed his notebook. Here's what's going to happen. The DA will review everything. The video is pretty damning for her, not you. She broke into your property multiple times, destroyed your property, made threats. Then she died while committing what amounts to criminal trespass. But there'll be an investigation. Her family might push for negligence charges. You had an open well on your property. Open well I discovered 2 days ago. That's been buried for 100 years. I know, and that'll matter, but prepare yourself for this to get complicated. It was almost dawn when the police finally left, taking Carol Weinstein's body with them. Jake sat on his back porch, watching the sun rise over the oak tree, over the well that had become a grave, over the yard that would never feel the same again. His phone buzzed. The neighborhood Facebook page. Someone had posted, Carol Weinstein, beloved HOA president and community leader, died last night in a tragic accident. She was murdered by Jake Morrison's negligence and disregard for safety. Justice for Carol, the comments were already multiplying. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Jake put his phone down and went inside to call his lawyer. This wasn't over. In a way, it was just beginning. But as he closed the door, he looked back at the oak tree, standing tall in the morning light, and felt something complicated twist in his chest. Relief, guilt, grief for a life lost, even a life that had made his own miserable. And underneath it all, a terrible, shameful thought that he couldn't quite suppress. The tree was safe now. The fence would stay. His home was his again. Carol Weinstein had spent months trying to force him to comply, to bend, to submit to her vision of perfect suburban order. In the end, she'd fallen victim to the one thing she could never control, the deep, dark history that existed beneath all their manicured lawns and perfect property lines. The land remembered what came before. The well had been waiting, patient as only stone and earth can be patient, for 130 years. And now, Carol Weinstein would be remembered too, not as a community leader or HOA president, but as a cautionary tale about the price of trespassing where you don't belong. Part 2, the aftermath. The detective came back 3 days later, this time with a woman from the DA's office who introduced herself as Assistant District Attorney Patricia Chen. They sat in Jake's living room, now repaired from the rock incident, and delivered news that felt like another kind of violation. Carol Weinstein's family is pushing for criminal negligence charges, Chen said without preamble. She was in her mid-30s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of directness Jake might have appreciated under different circumstances. Her husband, David Weinstein, is a corporate attorney. He's retained one of the best wrongful death lawyers in the state. Jake felt his stomach drop. She broke into my property multiple times. I have video evidence. No, we've reviewed all of it. Rodriguez leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The video actually helps your case significantly. It establishes a pattern of criminal trespass, harassment, property destruction. But here's the problem. You had an open well on your property, an unmarked hazard, that I discovered 48 hours before she fell into it, that had been buried for over a century. The law doesn't really care about the timeline, Chen said. The moment you uncovered that well, it became your responsibility to secure it properly. Yellow caution tape and some orange cones aren't adequate protection for a 20-foot drop. I was planning to. We know what you were planning. But intention doesn't change the fact that a woman died on your property due to an inadequate safety measure. Jake stood up, paced to the window. Outside, he could see neighbors walking past his house more slowly than necessary, phones out, taking pictures. His home had become a tourist attraction. The murder house, even though no one had been murdered. What are you telling me? He asked. We're telling you that the DA could charge you, Chen said. Negligent homicide, it probably wouldn't stick. The trespassing evidence is strong and her history of harassment provides context, but it could go to trial. Juries are unpredictable, especially in cases where someone died, and even if you're acquitted, you'd be looking at tens of thousands in legal fees. Your life would be on hold for months, maybe years. Rodriguez added, there's also the civil suit. David Weinstein filed papers yesterday, wrongful death. He's claiming that your negligence and his words malicious creation of an attractive hazard led to his wife's death. He's suing for $5 million. Number hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. $5 million. Jake laughed, and it came out slightly unhinged. For the woman who made my life hell, who vandalized my property, who broke into my yard at midnight with bolt cutters. Chen said simply, I know how it sounds. But here's what I need you to understand. This is going to get ugly. The media is already calling. Carol was well known in community organizing circles. She sat on 3 different boards. Her husband has connections throughout the city. They're going to paint her as a dedicated public servant struck down by a careless newcomer who didn't respect community standards. That's insane. That's narrative. And narrative matters more than facts in cases like this. Chen pulled out a folder, slid it across the coffee table. These are her medical records obtained through discovery. Did you know Carol Weinstein was on anti-anxiety medication? Had been for 6 years. She was seeing a therapist twice a week for what her doctor described as obsessive-compulsive tendencies and control-seeking behavior related to environmental anxiety. Jake picked up the folder, scanned the documents. Pages of psychiatric evaluations, prescriptions, therapy notes. One entry from 3 months ago stood out. Patient reports increasing stress related to new resident in community who refuses to comply with association rules. Patient describes intrusive thoughts about property violations, difficulty sleeping, compulsive checking behaviors. Recommended increased dosage of paroxetine and cognitive behavioral therapy focused on acceptance of things outside her control. She was sick, Jake said quietly. She was sick, Rodriguez agreed. And her family doesn't want that to be the story. They want the story to be about a pillar of the community killed by a negligent homeowner. So they're going to bury the mental health angle, emphasize the HOA violations angle, and make you out to be the villain. Chen stood up. Here's my advice off the record. Settle the civil suit. Whatever they're asking, negotiate it down and pay it. Make this go away. Because if this goes to trial, even if you win, you lose. The legal fees alone will bankrupt you, and your name will be permanently associated with her death. I didn't do anything wrong. Well was uncovered and inadequately secured on your property. That's something wrong in the eyes of the law, regardless of intent or circumstances. She softened slightly. I know this feels like an injustice. I've read the reports. I've seen what she did to you. But sometimes the system can't deliver the outcome that makes sense. Sometimes it can only deliver the outcome that's legally defensible. After they left, Jake sat in the silence of his house and felt the walls closing in. He'd bought this place to heal, to find peace after Sarah died, to build something resembling a life again. Instead, he'd walked into a war he never wanted to fight, and now he was dealing with the consequences of a victory he never sought. His phone rang. The lawyer from before, the one who'd quoted him $5,000 just to fight the fence issue. Mr. Morrison, I've been following your situation. I'd like to represent you both in the criminal matter if charges are filed and in the civil suit. My retainer for something this complex is $30,000. Jake hung up. The neighborhood meeting happened without him, but he heard about it anyway. Richard, the elderly man who'd stood up for the oak tree, called him that evening. Thought you should know what went down, Richard said. His voice was tired. David Weinstein came. Spoke for 20 minutes about Carol's dedication to the community. How she was out that night documenting violations because she cared so much about property values. How you're a danger to everyone. What did people say? More than you'd think agreed with him. You've got to understand, Jake, Carol ran this HOA like a military operation for 8 years. She made people feel safe, predictable. Even the ones who didn't like her methods appreciated the results. Property values did go up. The neighborhood does look pristine. Now she's gone and people are scared. Scared of what comes next. Scared of chaos. So they'd rather blame me. They'd rather have a simple answer to a complicated situation. You're the outsider, the one who didn't fit. It's easier to believe you're the problem than to accept that Carol was troubled, that the system she built was maybe too rigid. That control taken too far becomes tyranny. Jake heard ice clinking in a glass on Richard's end. There's something else you should know. David Weinstein was elected as the new HOA president. Unanimous vote. Jesus Christ. He's out for blood, Jake. He asked for a vote to revoke your membership in the association, which would give them grounds to force you to sell. It didn't pass, not enough votes, but it was close. 60-40. Can they even do that? Probably not legally, but they can make your life hell trying. Constant fines, constant citations, constant pressure. David has money and time and grief turning into rage. That's a dangerous combination. After Richard hung up, Jake walked out to his backyard. The well had been professionally sealed now. The county had insisted, and he'd paid $3,000 to have it done right. A concrete cap with a historical marker. The oak tree stood above it, branches moving in the evening breeze, indifferent to human drama. He'd received 17 different violation notices in the past 3 days. Everything from excessive tree root growth visible above ground to non-regulation garden gnome placement for a small ceramic frog Sarah had bought at a craft fair years ago. The frog was in a flower bed. The notices claimed it was visible from the street and violated the association's tasteful decoration guidelines. They were going to fine him into submission or bankruptcy, whichever came first. The first attorney who actually gave him hope was named Rebecca Winters. She was in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen every variation of human pettiness. She met him at a coffee shop rather than her office, which she explained was intentional. "I don't want David Weinstein knowing we've talked yet," she said. "He's monitoring you, I guarantee it. The man's obsessive, and now he's channeling his grief into destroying you. I've seen it before in these suburban feuds. It gets personal fast." "Do you know about my case?" I've handled 3 different lawsuits involving Maple Ridge Estates HOA. Carol Weinstein was the plaintiff in 2 of them. She lost both, but that didn't stop her from filing. The woman was relentless. Rebecca sipped her coffee. "I also knew her peripherally. We sat on a city planning committee together for 6 months. She was," Rebecca paused, choosing words carefully, "deeply invested in the appearance of order, to an unhealthy degree. DA showed me her medical records. Then you know this was a long time coming. Not the well specifically, but some kind of breaking point. People like Carol, they can't stop. The control becomes an addiction. They need constant validation that they're maintaining the standards, protecting the community, keeping the chaos at bay. When someone challenges that," she gestured at him, "you threatened her entire worldview just by existing in non-compliance. What do? We fight. Both cases, criminal and civil, and we win." Chen said I should settle. Is probably right from a purely financial standpoint, but you didn't ask me here for financial advice. You asked me here because you want someone who will fight for the principle of the thing. Am I wrong? Jake thought about the oak tree. Sarah touching bark and talking about elder beings. The house he'd chosen to heal in becoming a prison. The neighbors he'd never met already convinced he was a murderer. "What's your retainer?" he asked. 20,000, and I'm going to tell you right now, this could go north of 100,000 if it goes to trial. Both trials, potentially. You could lose your house paying legal fees even if you win the cases. Are you prepared for that? No, but I'm also not prepared to let David Weinstein rewrite history. His wife harassed me for months. She broke into my property multiple times. She died committing a crime. I didn't kill her. I didn't want her dead. But I'm not going to be crucified for the fact that she couldn't stop trying to control things that weren't hers to control. Rebecca smiled, and it was predatory. Good. Then let's make them regret coming after you. Deposition for the civil case happened in a sterile conference room downtown, all white walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. David Weinstein sat across the table from Jake, and the resemblance to Carol was unsettling. The same sharp features, the same assessing eyes. But where Carol's intensity had been brittle and frantic, David's was cold and calculated. His attorney, Marcus Holloway, had a reputation that preceded him. 3 decades of high-profile wrongful death cases, a 90% win rate, a penthouse office, and a fee structure that started at $850 an hour. "Mr. Morrison," Holloway began, voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "When did you first become aware that there was a well on your property?" "The afternoon of May 14th. Sunday, I was using ground-penetrating radar equipment I'd rented to survey historical features of the lot." "What did you do when you discovered this well?" "I carefully excavated the area around the opening, removed the rotted boards and metal plate that had been covering it, examined the structure. You immediately take steps to secure this hazard. I put up caution tape and orange traffic cones around the perimeter. I plan to contact a historical preservation society the next day to discuss proper capping procedures. You didn't secure the well itself. The opening remained exposed. Temporarily, yes. I placed the boards back over it, but not secured. It was meant to be a temporary measure for less than 24 hours. Holloway made a note. Were you aware that your property is subject to HOA bylaws that require homeowners to maintain their property in a safe condition? Aware of the bylaws. I wasn't aware that safe condition extended to historical features buried 2 feet underground for over a century. Once you excavated that feature, it was no longer buried. It was an exposed hazard on your property. Did you notify the HOA of this hazard? No, I didn't think. You didn't think. My client's wife died because you didn't think. She died because you created a death trap on your property and failed to adequately secure it or warn anyone of its existence. Rebecca cut in. Objection, argumentative and assumes facts not in evidence. Holloway continued without acknowledging her. Mr. Morrison, did you want my client's wife dead? No, absolutely not. You filed for a restraining order against her 2 weeks before her death. True. True. Because she was trespassing on my property, repeatedly. Because you wanted to create a legal paper trail that would justify what you were planning. Rebecca slammed her hand on the table. That's outrageous. You're implying my client murdered Mrs. Weinstein. This is a civil proceeding about negligence, not a criminal trial for murder. Isn't it murder? Holloway said softly. When you create a lethal trap on your property, knowing that a specific person has a pattern of entering that property, and then you leave that trap exposed and unmarked until that person falls into it and dies. The room went silent. Jake felt his blood turn to ice. This wasn't just a wrongful death suit. This was David Weinstein trying to build a narrative of premeditated murder. The restraining order wasn't protection, it was evidence of planning. The security cameras weren't for safety, they were to document Carol's trespassing pattern. The uncovered well wasn't an accident, it was a trap, baited with the oak tree Carol wanted to cut down, positioned perfectly along her usual path. Insane, Jake said. I'm thorough. And I'm going to prove that you deliberately created the conditions that led to my client's wife's death. That you knew she would come onto your property, that you knew she would be focused on the tree. That you left that well exposed specifically for her to fall into. I discovered the well 2 days before she died, you claim. But isn't it convenient that a well appears exactly when you need it? Exactly where it would do the most damage to the person harassing you? Rebecca stood up. We're done here. This deposition is over. If you want to pursue a criminal theory, Mr. Holloway, tell the DA's office. But don't use a civil proceeding to fish for a murder case that doesn't exist. They left, but Jake's hands were shaking. In the elevator, Rebecca turned to him. Going for broke, she said. This isn't about money anymore. David Weinstein wants you in prison. He's going to push the DA to file murder charges. What evidence? The timeline doesn't support premeditation. I couldn't have known she'd come that specific night. She'd been coming regularly, multiple times a week, always late at night. The security footage establishes a pattern. A good prosecutor could argue you knew it was only a matter of time before she showed up, saw the caution tape around the tree, investigated, and fell. Jake leaned against the elevator wall. This is insane. I'm being accused of murder because a woman who was harassing me died while committing a crime on my property. Welcome to the American legal system, where narrative beats facts and grief beats logic. The elevator doors opened. But here's what you need to remember. They have to prove their narrative beyond a reasonable doubt. We just have to create enough doubt to break their story. Can you do that? I don't know. Figure it out. Because if the DA files murder charges, your life as you know it is over, regardless of the verdict. The criminal charges came 3 weeks later, not murder. Criminally negligent homicide. The DA's office had reviewed Holloway's deposition, reviewed the evidence, and decided there was enough to proceed. The charge carried up to 4 years in prison if convicted. Jake was arrested at 6 a.m. on a Wednesday, patrol cars surrounding his house, neighbors filming from their windows as he was led out in handcuffs. The perp walk was deliberate. The DA was running for re-election, and a case about an HOA dispute gone fatal was perfect media fodder. Morrison, you are being charged with criminally negligent homicide in the death of Carol Weinstein. You have the right to remain silent. Words washed over him. He focused on the oak tree visible over the officer's shoulder, leaves bright in the early morning sun. Sarah's voice in his memory. Trees are the elders, they'll be hereafter. He thought buying this house would be a refuge. Instead, it had become the center of a storm that threatened to destroy everything he had left. Bail was set at $250,000. Jake paid a bondsman $25,000, money he didn't have, money he put on credit cards to get out. He came home to find his front lawn vandalized, spray-painted with words like murderer and justice for Carol. Someone had thrown paint on the oak tree, red streaks running down its trunk like blood. He cleaned it up alone at midnight, scrubbing graffiti off his sidewalk while the neighborhood slept, or pretended to sleep. He could feel eyes watching from dark windows, people judging, condemning, already convinced of his guilt. His phone buzzed constantly. Media requests, interview requests. A producer from a true crime podcast wanting to tell his side of the story. He ignored them all. The only call he answered was from Richard. Sorry, Jake. I tried to talk to people, but David's been running a campaign. He's convinced half the neighborhood you're a murderer. The other half is just scared. People are talking about moving. Property values are dropping. Everyone's angry, and you're the easiest target. I didn't do anything wrong. I know. But in cases like this, truth is less important than perception. And right now, the perception is that a beloved community leader died on your property and you're being charged with a crime. That's all people see. Jake sat on his back porch looking at the sealed well, the memorial plaque that had been placed there. Historic well circa 1890s, restored and preserved 2024. Preserved. What a word, the well had been preserved. Carol Weinstein had not. Richard, Jake said slowly. Carol's medical records, the stuff about her mental health, can that be used in court? I'm not a lawyer, but I'd think so. Why? Because if this is going to trial, I need people to understand who she was, not the St. David's painting, the real woman, the one who couldn't stop, who couldn't let go, who turned harassment into a crusade. Careful, Jake. Speaking ill of the dead, especially a dead woman, is a good way to turn a jury against you. I'm not speaking ill. I'm speaking truth. And if the truth makes people uncomfortable, that's their problem, not mine. After he hung up, Jake went to his computer and started writing. Everything. The entire timeline, every interaction with Carol, every violation notice, every trespass captured on camera, the rock through his window, the spray paint on his tree, the anonymous threats, the restraining order hearing, the night she died. He wrote for 6 hours straight, and when he was done, he had a 40-page document that read like a psychological thriller. The story of a woman whose need for control had spiraled into obsession, and a man who just wanted to be left alone. He sent it to Rebecca. She called him 2 hours later. "This is good. This is really good, but you understand what happens if we use this, right? We're putting Carol Weinstein on trial. We're arguing that she was mentally ill, that she was the aggressor, that her death was the inevitable consequence of her own actions. Her family will hate you. The media will crucify you. You'll be the man who blamed his victim. Wasn't my victim. I was hers for months. I know that, but that's not how it'll play. Don't care anymore. I'm not going to prison for defending my property and my peace. If that means exposing who Carol really was, so be it. The dead don't get to rewrite history just because they're dead." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "Okay, then we go to war, full scorched earth. We put the HOA on trial, we put Carol's mental health on trial, we put David Weinstein's narrative on trial, and we make sure the jury understands that the real crime here wasn't negligence, it was harassment that ended in tragedy. How do we do that? We tell your story, all of it. And we make them see what Carol Weinstein couldn't see, that there are consequences to invading someone's peace, even fatal ones." Jake looked out at his backyard, at the oak tree standing sentinel at the well that had become a grave and a symbol. The land had been here long before Carol Weinstein, long before the HOA, long before any of them, and it would be here long after, patient and indifferent to human drama, holding its secrets in stone and earth and the deep, dark places beneath the surface. The trial was set for September, 3 months away, 3 months to prepare to fight to prove that he wasn't a killer, just a man who'd had the misfortune of being in the path of a woman who couldn't stop destroying herself and everyone around her. The well had waited 130 years. Jake could wait 3 more months, and then, finally, the truth would come to light. Part 3. The trial, the courthouse steps had become a battleground before jury selection even began. Jake arrived with Rebecca on a muggy Monday morning in September to find protesters on both sides of the walkway. On the left, a group of about 30 people holding signs that read, "Justice for Carol" and "HOA Lives Matter," and inexplicably, "Property values are human values." On the right, a smaller group, maybe a dozen, with signs reading "Defend Your Castle" and "TRESPSSERS Beware," and one that made Jake uncomfortable. "Stand your ground. Don't look at them," Rebecca murmured. "Don't react, just walk." David Weinstein was already inside, holding court with a cluster of reporters. He'd lost weight since Carol's death, his expensive suit hanging slightly loose, and he'd grown a beard that made him look like a revolutionary rather than a corporate attorney. The grief-stricken widower performing for the cameras. "Mr. Weinstein," a reporter called out, "do you believe justice will be served today?" "I believe my wife was murdered by a man who couldn't respect basic community standards," David said, voice carrying through the marble lobby. "A man who set a trap and waited for her to fall into it. I believe the evidence will show that Jake Morrison is guilty of criminally negligent homicide at minimum and potentially premeditated murder." "That's not what he's charged with," Rebecca said, loud enough for the microphones to catch. David turned to her, and the look on his face was pure hatred. "Yet, he's not charged with murder yet." "But the truth has a way of coming out during trials, doesn't it, Ms. Winters?" They moved past into the courtroom, and Jake felt the weight of every eye on him. The gallery was packed, neighbors from Maple Ridge Estates, local media, random courthouse regulars who came for the entertainment. He recognized Richard in the 3rd row, offering a subtle nod of support. Everyone else looked at him like he was already convicted. Judge Margaret Thornton entered, and the bailiff called for order. Thornton was in her late 60s, with steel-gray hair and a reputation for running an absolutely tight courtroom. She'd been a prosecutor for 20 years before ascending to the bench, and she had no patience for theatrics. We're here for the matter of the state versus Jake Morrison, criminally negligent homicide. Counsel, are you ready to begin jury selection? The prosecutor, Assistant DA Patricia Chen, stood. Ready, Your Honor. Ready, Your Honor, Rebecca echoed. What followed was 3 days of the most exhausting process Jake had ever experienced. Potential jurors were brought in groups of 12, questioned extensively about their knowledge of the case, their feelings about HOAs, their opinions on property rights versus community standards, their ability to be impartial. The local media coverage had been intense. Everyone in the jury pool had heard something about the case. The question was whether they'd formed immovable opinions. Juror number 7, Chen asked a middle-aged woman in a cardigan. You stated you live in a neighborhood with an HOA. How do you feel about homeowners who don't follow association rules? The woman shifted uncomfortably. I think rules exist for a reason. When people don't follow them, it affects everyone's property values. Strike for cause, Rebecca said immediately. Bias against the defendant. Honor, Chen protested. Living in an HOA doesn't automatically create bias. Believing that rule breakers deserve consequences might, Judge Thornton said. Strike granted. Juror 7 is excused. Dance continued. Chen wanted jurors who valued community standards, who understood that neighbors had obligations to each other. Rebecca wanted jurors who valued individual property rights, who understood that harassment was real even when cloaked in administrative authority. By Wednesday afternoon, they had 12 jurors and 4 alternates, 6 women, 6 men. Mix of ages and backgrounds, 3 owned homes in HOA developments. 2 had had disputes with HOAs. 7 claimed no strong feelings either way. It would have to do. Chen's opening statement was delivered with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about responsibility. On the night of May 16, 2024, Carol Weinstein, a dedicated community servant, a loving wife, a woman who cared deeply about her neighborhood, died in a horrific fall into an uncovered well on the defendant's property. She suffered multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and a severed spinal cord. She died alone in the dark, 20 feet below the earth, in a hole that should never have been left exposed. Defense will try to tell you that Mrs. Weinstein was trespassing, that she somehow deserved what happened to her. But the law is clear. Property owners have a duty to maintain their land in a reasonably safe condition. When you dig up a well, a deadly hazard, you don't just put some caution tape around it and hope for the best. You secure it immediately. You call professionals. You make sure no one can fall in. Mr. Morrison did none of those things. He uncovered that well on Sunday, May 14th. He had 48 hours to secure it properly before Mrs. Weinstein died. 48 hours to prevent this tragedy. He chose not to, and a woman paid for that choice with her life. Chen returned to her seat, leaving the image of Carol dying alone in the dark hanging in the air. Rebecca stood, smoothed her blazer, and walked to the jury box with the confidence of someone who'd been doing this for 30 years. MS. Chen just told you this case is about responsibility. She's right. But she's wrong about whose responsibility matters here. Carol Weinstein broke into my client's property, not once, not twice, multiple times over several months. We have video evidence of her climbing his fence, cutting his locks, entering his backyard in the middle of the night with tools designed to destroy his property. She spray-painted his tree. She filed false reports with the county. She conducted what can only be described as a campaign of harassment against a man whose only crime was refusing to cut down a 100-year-old oak tree. On the night she died, Mrs. Weinstein was committing a crime. She cut through a locked gate with bolt cutters at 11:47 p.m. and entered property that was not hers without permission, with the intent to document violations that would allow her to fine and potentially force my client from his home. Well, she fell into was not a trap. It was a historical feature my client had discovered 2 days earlier. He had marked it with caution tape. He had placed boards over the opening. He had planned to have it properly sealed the following week. What he could not have anticipated, what no reasonable person would have anticipated, was that someone would break into his yard in the middle of the night, ignore warning markers, and walk directly into an area that was clearly marked as hazardous. This case isn't about negligence. It's about consequence. Carol Weinstein spent months invading my client's peace, destroying his property, and trying to force him to comply with her vision of perfection. She died while committing yet another invasion, and while her death is tragic, it is not my client's fault. It is the inevitable result of her own choices. Rebecca sat down. The jury looked thoughtful, confused, engaged. That was all she could ask for. The state's first witness was the medical examiner, Dr. Raymond Park. He took the stand with the weary professionalism of someone who testified hundreds of times. Chen walked him through Carol's injuries with clinical precision. Fractured skull, broken neck, severed spine, ruptured organs, massive internal bleeding. Death would have been relatively quick, maybe 3 to 5 minutes from impact to loss of consciousness. In your professional opinion, Dr. Park, was this death preventable? If the well had been properly secured with a locked grate or concrete cap, yes. Mrs. Weinstein would not have been able to fall in. In your examination of the well, was there adequate warning of the hazard? There was caution tape around the perimeter and traffic cones, but the well opening itself was only covered by loose boards. Someone stepping on them would fall through. Rebecca's cross-examination was brief. Dr. Park, in your professional opinion, would a person committing criminal trespass at midnight be likely to see and heed caution tape? That's not a medical question. Me rephrase, the area around the well was marked with bright yellow caution tape and orange traffic cones. Correct. Correct. Someone would have to deliberately ignore or bypass those warnings to reach the boards covering the well itself. Correct. Park hesitated. Someone moving quickly or not paying attention might not see them at night. Or someone focused on reaching a specific target, say, a tree they'd been documenting for months, might not care about warnings in their path. Objection, Chen called. Speculation. Sustained. Move on, Ms. Winters. Rebecca nodded. No further questions. The second day of testimony brought the security footage. Chen played it on a large screen for the jury, Carol cutting through the gate lock, entering the yard, walking toward the oak tree, then the sudden fall. The scream, the impact, the silence. 2 jurors looked away. One, an older woman, wiped her eyes. This is the moment Carol Weinstein died, Chen said. Captured on Mr. Morrison's security cameras. Cameras he installed specifically to document Mrs. Weinstein's visits to his property. Some might ask, if you're so concerned about trespassing, why not call the police during one of these visits? Why just record them? It was a good question, and Jake saw several jurors nodding. But Chen made a mistake. She played the full compilation of Carol's trespasses, all 17 times she'd entered Jake's yard over 4 months. The jury watched her spray painting the tree, measuring the fence, digging near the property line, examining the oak tree's roots with what looked like a drill. By the 10th clip, the jurors' expressions had shifted. This wasn't a woman innocently checking property lines. This was obsessive behavior, compulsive, disturbing. Rebecca stood for cross-examination. Ms. Chen, you asked why Mr. Morrison didn't call the police during these incidents. I'd like to enter into evidence the police reports he did file. She presented 7 different police reports Jake had filed over 4 months. Officers had responded twice. Both times they'd told him it was a civil matter. Both times they'd suggested he install cameras and file for a restraining order, which he had done. So my client did exactly what law enforcement advised. He documented the harassment. He filed for legal protection. And when that restraining order was denied, he continued documenting because he had no other recourse. Is that negligence, or is that a citizen desperately trying to protect his property through legal means? Chen had no good answer. David Weinstein took the stand on day 3. He'd been prepped well, measured responses, controlled emotion, the perfect grieving husband. Chen walked him through Carol's dedication to the community. The neighborhood watch programs she'd founded. The property value increases during her tenure as HOA president. The beautification projects she'd championed. She was a saint in designer athletic wear, beloved by all, cut down in her prime. Tell us about the last time you saw your wife, Chen said gently. David's voice broke slightly. She was upset that evening, stressed about the Morrison situation. She'd been trying for months to help him understand that communities have standards for a reason, that his refusal to comply was affecting property values, creating precedent for other violations. She took it personally when people didn't respect the rules. She mentioned going to his property that night? No, but she often couldn't sleep when she was stressed. She'd go for walks, check on things. I assumed she'd gone to bed. I didn't know until the police called that she. He trailed off, genuine tears in his eyes. Rebecca stood. Mr. Weinstein, I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but I need to ask you some difficult questions about your wife's mental health. David's expression hardened. My wife was not mentally ill. I didn't say she was ill. But she was in treatment for anxiety and obsessive-compulsive tendencies. Correct. She saw a therapist. Many people do. Rebecca presented the medical records. According to her psychiatrist, Dr. Ellen Frazier, your wife exhibited obsessive focus on environmental control, compulsive checking behaviors related to neighborhood standards, and intrusive thoughts about specific residents who violated HOA covenants. Those are direct quotes from her medical file. That doesn't mean your wife was on 40 milligrams of paroxetine daily. That's a significant dosage for anxiety and OCD. Her doctor recommended increasing it to 60 milligrams 3 weeks before her death because her symptoms were worsening. Were you aware of that? David's jaw clenched. We discussed her medication, yes. You aware that her intrusive thoughts were specifically about my client, that she couldn't sleep because she was thinking about his property violations, that she was checking his yard multiple times per week, compulsively documenting everything. Objection, Chen called. Harassment of the witness, establishing the state of mind of the deceased, Rebecca said, which is relevant to whether her actions the night of her death were reasonable or compulsive. Judge Thornton considered. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Ms. Winters. Rebecca turned back to David. Your wife was trespassing on my client's property multiple times per week, sometimes multiple times per night, for months. She was documenting violations that didn't exist. She was spray painting property that wasn't hers. She cut through a locked gate with bolt cutters at midnight. Does any of that sound like the behavior of someone who was thinking clearly? My wife was protecting the community. Your wife was obsessing over things she couldn't control. And tragically, that obsession led her to break into someone's yard at midnight, ignore safety warnings, and fall into a well. That's not my client's fault. That's a tragedy born from mental illness that wasn't adequately treated. David stood up in the witness box, face flushed with rage. Don't you dare blame Carol for this. She died because he created a death trap. She died because she couldn't stop invading someone else's property. Rebecca shot back. And I'm sorry, Mr. Weinstein, but your grief doesn't change that fundamental fact. Judge Thornton banged her gavel. Order, Mr. Weinstein, sit down. Ms. Winters, you've made your point. Move on or conclude your cross. Rebecca took a breath. No further questions, Your Honor. David left the stand looking like he wanted to kill someone, probably Jake. The defense case began on day 4. Rebecca called a parade of witnesses. The arborist who'd certified the oak tree as healthy, neighbors who'd witnessed Carol's harassment, including Richard, who testified about the HOA meeting where Carol had argued for forcing Jake to sell. The police officers who'd told Jake there was nothing they could do. The surveyor who'd verified Jake's property lines. Then she called Dr. Ellen Frazier, Carol's psychiatrist. Frazier was in her 60s with the calm demeanor of someone who'd spent decades listening to people's deepest problems. She'd been subpoenaed, and she was clearly uncomfortable testifying about a former patient. Dr. Frazier, Rebecca began, you treated Carol Weinstein for how long? 6 years, from 2018 until her death. What was her diagnosis? Generalized anxiety disorder with obsessive-compulsive features. She exhibited significant control-seeking behaviors, particularly related to her environment and community. You explain what that means in layman's terms? Frazier nodded. Carol had a deep-seated need for order and predictability. When things in her environment didn't conform to her expectations, it created severe anxiety. She would engage in compulsive checking behaviors, driving through the neighborhood multiple times per day, documenting perceived violations, spending hours on HOA business. It was a way of managing her anxiety through control. This getting better or worse over time? Worse, significantly worse in the last year. She'd become fixated on specific homes, specific residents. She couldn't let go of perceived violations. It was consuming her life. You recommend treatment beyond medication? I recommended intensive therapy, possibly a leave of absence from her HOA responsibilities. I felt her position was feeding her compulsions rather than fulfilling a civic duty. But she refused. She believed she was protecting the community, that relaxing her vigilance would lead to chaos. Rebecca paused. In your professional opinion, on the night of May 16th, when Carol Weinstein broke into my client's property at midnight, was she acting rationally? Objection? Chen was on her feet. Calls for speculation about a specific event. Frazier treated Mrs. Weinstein for years and had documented her behavioral patterns. I think she's qualified to opine on whether those patterns suggest rational decision-making. Judge Thornton thought about it. I'll allow it within limits. Dr. Frazier, based on your treatment of Mrs. Weinstein and your knowledge of her mental health, can you speak to her likely state of mind? Frazier looked deeply uncomfortable. Based on our last session, 2 days before her death, Carol was in a heightened state of anxiety specifically about Mr. Morrison's property. She described intrusive thoughts about the tree, the fence, the garden. She'd been losing sleep over it. She'd mentioned feeling like she needed to fix the situation before it got worse. In my professional opinion, her decision to enter his property at midnight was likely driven by compulsive anxiety rather than rational thought. So she was mentally ill, Rebecca said. She was struggling with mental illness, yes. That doesn't excuse her actions, but it contextualizes them. Carol wasn't a villain. She was sick, and her sickness drove her to behaviors that ultimately cost her her life. Courtroom was silent. Chen's cross-examination tried to rehabilitate the narrative. Dr. Frazier, many people have anxiety and OCD and don't trespass on property. That's correct. So mental illness doesn't absolve someone of responsibility for their actions. No, it doesn't. It certainly doesn't absolve someone of responsibility when their negligence causes another person's death, even if that person was trespassing. Can't speak to legal responsibility. I can only speak to Carol's state of mind. It was a partial recovery, but the damage was done. The jury had seen Carol Weinstein transformed from saint to tragic figure struggling with illness. Sympathy for her death remained, but the narrative of Jake as villain had fractured. Jake took the stand on day 5. It was a risk defendants often didn't testify, but Rebecca felt it was necessary for the jury to hear his story directly. Chen went straight for the throat. Mr. Morrison, you hated Carol Weinstein, didn't hate her. I wanted her to leave me alone. You filed for a restraining order against her. After months of harassment, after she'd vandalized my property multiple times. You installed security cameras specifically to catch her trespassing. I installed security cameras because the police told me to document the harassment. You kept those recordings, watched them, knew her patterns. Jake saw where this was going. I kept them as evidence. I didn't study them to plan anything. I wanted proof if I needed to go back to court. You knew she came to your property at night. You knew she was focused on the oak tree. You uncovered a well directly in the path someone would take from your gate to that tree. Isn't that convenient? I didn't uncover the well because of Carol. I uncovered it because I was interested in the history of my property. It was pure coincidence, was it? Or did you see an opportunity to solve your Carol Weinstein problem permanently? Rebecca objected, but the question hung in the air. The jury was watching Jake carefully. Never wanted her dead, Jake said, and his voice cracked. I wanted my tree, my peace, my home. I just lost my wife a year ago. I bought this house to heal, to start over, and Carol made it hell. But I didn't want her dead. I just wanted her to stop. Emotion was real, raw. Several jurors softened. Chen pressed. If you didn't want her on your property, why didn't you build a higher fence, install motion-activated alarms? Take additional security measures. Because I shouldn't have to turn my home into a fortress because one person couldn't respect boundaries. The outburst was genuine, and it landed. Jake saw it in the jurors' faces, recognition, sympathy, understanding. They might not live in HOA neighborhoods, but everyone understood what it felt like to be pushed too far. Rebecca's redirect was simple. Jake, in your own words, tell the jury what you were doing the night Carol Weinstein died. I was asleep. I got a motion alert on my phone at 11:47. I pulled up the camera feed and saw her cutting through my gate. I watched her walk into my yard. I saw her fall. I called 911 immediately and did everything I could to help, but she was already gone. You do anything to cause her fall? No, I put up caution tape. I placed boards over the well. I was planning to have it permanently sealed within the week. I never imagined someone would break into my yard in the middle of the night and walk through a clearly marked hazard. Thank you. No further questions. Closing arguments came on day 6. The courtroom was packed, standing room only, media cameras positioned to catch every word. Chen spoke first. Ladies and gentlemen, this case comes down to one question. Did Jake Morrison exercise reasonable care in securing a deadly hazard on his property? The answer is no, he didn't. Caution tape and loose boards are not reasonable security for a 20-foot drop. He had 48 hours to do the right thing. He chose not to, and Carol Weinstein died as a result. Defense wants you to believe she deserved it, that she was mentally ill, that she was trespassing, that her death was somehow her own fault. But the law doesn't allow property owners to create deadly traps, even for trespassers. The law requires reasonable care. Jake Morrison failed that standard, and a woman is dead. That is criminally negligent homicide. Find him guilty. Rebecca stood, and Jake could see the fire in her eyes. Prosecution wants you to believe that Jake Morrison is responsible for every choice Carol Weinstein made. That he should have anticipated a woman with severe OCD would break into his property at midnight, ignore safety warnings, and walk directly into a hazard. That's not reasonable. That's impossible. Carol Weinstein was sick, tragically, terribly sick. And instead of getting help, instead of stepping back from the HOA role that was feeding her compulsions, she escalated. She harassed my client for months. She vandalized his property. She filed false reports. She became obsessed to the point where her own psychiatrist recommended she take a leave of absence. On the night she died, she committed a crime. She cut through a locked gate with bolt cutters. She trespassed on property where she'd been explicitly told she wasn't welcome. She ignored safety markers. And she fell into a well that, while uncovered, was clearly marked as dangerous. That is not Jake Morrison's fault. That is tragedy. That is the inevitable consequence of mental illness that spiraled out of control. My client didn't create the conditions that killed Carol Weinstein. She created them herself through months of obsessive, compulsive, illegal behavior. Find him not guilty. Because the alternative is to say that homeowners are responsible for the safety of people who break into their property. And that's not justice. That's insanity. Jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. Jake spent that time in a fog, unable to eat, unable to sleep, just waiting. Rebecca tried to prepare him for both outcomes, but her confidence had wavered. Juries are unpredictable, she kept saying. We presented a strong case, but emotion matters if they're sympathetic to Carol. On day 2 at 4:17 p.m., the bailiff announced the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled in minutes. Jake took his seat next to Rebecca, hands shaking, trying to breathe normally. David Weinstein sat across the aisle, face expressionless, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. The jury filed in. Jake tried to read their faces. Some looked at him, some didn't. What did that mean? Judge Thornton spoke. Has the jury reached a verdict? The forewoman, a schoolteacher in her 40s, stood. We have, Your Honor. The matter of the state versus Jake Morrison on the charge of criminally negligent homicide. How do you find? The pause was eternal. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. Rebecca's hand found his under the table, squeezed once. We find the defendant not guilty. Courtroom exploded. Cheers from Jake's side, howls of outrage from Carol's supporters. David Weinstein stood up, face purple with rage, and had to be restrained by bailiffs as he screamed that it was a miscarriage of justice. Jake sat frozen, unable to process. Not guilty. It was over. Judge Thornton banged her gavel repeatedly. Order, order, or I'll clear the courtroom. When silence finally descended, she turned to Jake. Mr. Morrison, you're free to go. This case is dismissed. Rebecca pulled him into a hug. We did it. You're free. But as Jake walked out of the courtroom, past the cameras and the protesters and David Weinstein's hateful glare, he didn't feel free. He felt exhausted, hollowed out. He'd been vindicated, but at what cost? The civil trial was still coming. David had made it clear he would pursue the wrongful death suit regardless of the criminal verdict. And even if Jake won that too, he'd still have to go home to Maple Ridge Estates, where half his neighbors thought he was a murderer who'd gotten away with it. He'd won the battle, but the war was far from over, and somewhere beneath his backyard, in a well that had been sealed and marked with a plaque, Carol Weinstein's obsession had finally found its end. The land had swallowed her whole, the way it swallowed everything eventually. Trees are the elders, Sarah had said. They'll be hereafter. The oak still stood. Jake was still standing too, but he felt like a dead tree, upright but hollow, waiting for the next storm to finally knock him down. Part 4, The Reckoning. The not guilty verdict made national news, but not in the way Jake had hoped. The headlines weren't about justice served or a homeowner vindicated. They were about suburban warfare, HOA horror stories, and whether property owners had too much or too little right to defend their land. The case became a Rorschach test. Everyone saw what they wanted to see. Conservative media portrayed Jake as a hero defending his castle from government overreach disguised as an HOA. Liberal outlets painted him as a privileged homeowner who'd created a deadly hazard and escaped accountability through expensive lawyers. True crime podcasters dissected every detail, speculating about whether it was really an accident or a perfectly planned murder. None of them understood what it was like to live in the aftermath. Jake came home from the courthouse to find his house egged again, windows broken again, lawn torn up. Someone had poured concrete down his outdoor water spigots. His mailbox had been ripped from the ground and thrown through his garage door window. The oak tree had been vandalized with a chainsaw, not cut down, but wounded, deep gouges in the trunk that would take years to heal if they healed at all. The police came, took a report, said there was nothing they could do without witnesses or security footage. But Jake's cameras had been spray-painted over the night before. Whoever did this had planned it carefully. He cleaned up alone again. Richard came over to help, and together they patched the windows with plywood, swept up the eggs and concrete chunks, tried to assess the damage to the oak tree. You need to move, Richard said finally. This neighborhood is toxic now. Half the people think you're a hero, half think you're a killer, and everyone's angry. It's only going to get worse. Not letting them drive me out. This is my home. It worth dying for? Jake looked at the old man. What? Richard lowered his voice. David Weinstein has been making threats, not directly. He's too smart for that, but he's been asking questions, floating theories. I heard him tell someone at the grocery store that the criminal trial was rigged, that the jury was corrupted, that real justice hadn't been served yet. Can say whatever he wants. I was acquitted. Jake, I'm 74 years old. I've lived through a lot of neighborhood disputes. I've never seen one this poisonous. People are choosing sides like it's a war. Your mail carrier quit because she was getting harassed for delivering to you. The teenager who mows lawns on this street was told his parents would be fined if he mowed yours. This isn't about Carol anymore. This is about ideology, about control, about everything that's broken in our suburbs. Jake sat down on his porch steps, suddenly exhausted. I just wanted a place to heal. After Sarah died, I thought I could start over, build something peaceful. I know. But you picked the wrong neighborhood, or maybe the neighborhood picked you. Either way, you're the focal point now, and focal points get destroyed. After Richard left, Jake sat in his darkening backyard and made a decision. He would fight the civil suit. He would win. And then he would sell this house and never look back. Maple Ridge Estates could have its perfect lawns and rigid standards and obsessive control. He was done. The civil trial began 3 months later, in January, in a different courtroom but with the same circus atmosphere. David Weinstein's wrongful death suit sought $5 million in damages, but everyone understood it wasn't really about money. It was about punishment, revenge, making Jake pay in a way the criminal trial hadn't allowed. Marcus Holloway, David's attorney, had refined his strategy. He wasn't arguing that Jake had murdered Carol, that ship had sailed. Instead, he was arguing attractive nuisance combined with reckless disregard for human safety. Well wasn't just uncovered, Holloway told the jury in his opening statement. It was deliberately positioned to attract Mrs. Weinstein's attention. Mr. Morrison knew she was focused on the oak tree. He knew she would investigate any activity near it. By uncovering the well in that specific location and leaving it inadequately secured, he created an irresistible lure for a woman whose mental health issues he was aware of. This wasn't negligence. This was reckless disregard for human life. It was a clever argument because it incorporated the mental health evidence without quite calling it premeditation. Jake had known Carol was obsessive. He'd known she'd be drawn to investigate anything near the tree. Therefore, leaving an uncovered well near the tree was, essentially, setting a trap for someone he knew couldn't resist investigating it. Rebecca's counterargument focused on the legal doctrine of trespassers and assumption of risk. Carol Weinstein was not a child drawn to a swimming pool, she told the jury. She was a 47-year-old woman, fully aware she was trespassing, fully aware she was breaking the law. She cut through a locked gate with bolt cutters at midnight. She ignored caution tape and traffic cones marking a hazard. Under the law, trespassers assume the risk of dangers on the property they're illegally entering. My client had no duty to make his property safe for someone who was committing a crime by being there. Trial lasted 2 weeks. It covered much of the same ground as the criminal trial, the harassment, the trespassing, the mental health records, the security footage. But there were new elements, too. Holloway brought in a civil engineer who testified that the well should have been secured with a locked steel grate the moment it was uncovered. He brought in a safety expert who said that caution tape was inadequate for a hazard of this magnitude. He even brought in a psychologist who testified that Jake, as a reasonable person, should have anticipated that someone with OCD would be drawn to investigate anything unusual on the property they'd become obsessed with. You can't claim you didn't know she'd come back, the psychologist said. The security footage shows 17 separate trespassing incidents over 4 months. That's a clear pattern. A reasonable person would understand that whatever was placed near the oak tree would attract her attention. Rebecca destroyed him on cross-examination. So your position is that my client should have anticipated that a woman would break into his property at midnight, ignore safety warnings, and walk directly into a marked hazard. If he knew she had OCD and was obsessed with that area, yes. Even though she was committing a crime by being there, the law recognizes that some hazards are so dangerous they require protection even for trespassers. Like what? Swimming pools for children. Construction sites with mandatory fencing. Industrial facilities with toxic materials. Are you seriously arguing that a homeowner who discovers a historical well on his property has the same duty as a chemical plant? The psychologist shifted uncomfortably. I'm saying the defendant knew enough about Mrs. Weinstein's mental state to anticipate she would investigate anything unusual on his property. Knew she was harassing him. He knew she was trespassing. He didn't know she'd be reckless enough to walk through caution tape at midnight and fall into a well. No reasonable person would anticipate that level of recklessness. It was a strong cross, but Holloway had planted the seed. Could Jake have anticipated it? Should he have done more? The turning point came when Holloway called Jake's own expert witness, the archaeologist from the Historical Society who'd examined the well. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to the Ada, had testified in the criminal trial about the well's historical significance. She described it as a rare example of 1890s hand-dug well construction, valuable for understanding settlement patterns in the region. But Holloway had found something in her report that Rebecca had missed. Dr. Chen, in your initial examination of the well, you recommended it be immediately secured with a temporary cap pending full restoration. Is that correct? Yes, that's standard procedure for any excavated historical feature that presents a safety hazard. What did you recommend specifically? A wooden platform bolted over the opening with warning signs and perimeter fencing, something substantial enough to prevent accidental falls. Mr. Morrison, implement your recommendations. Dr. Chen looked uncomfortable. Not entirely. He put up caution tape and placed the old boards back over the opening, but there was no platform, no bolted security, no perimeter fencing. Would you recommend those specific measures? Because historical wells, especially hand-dug ones, are extremely dangerous. The depth, the narrow opening, the stone construction, a fall into one is almost certainly fatal. We never leave them exposed without substantial security. Holloway produced her email to Jake, sent 3 days before Carol's death. Please read the highlighted section for the jury. Dr. Chen read, Jake, I can't stress enough how dangerous that well is. I understand you want to preserve it, but until we can do a proper restoration, it must be secured with more than just caution tape. A child, an animal, or even an adult could easily fall in, and at that depth, rescue would be nearly impossible. Please have a platform installed immediately, or I'll have to recommend the county force you to fill it in for safety reasons. The courtroom was silent. You sent that email to Mr. Morrison 3 days before Mrs. Weinstein's death, Holloway said, warning him that an adult could easily fall in. Did he? Said he understood and would take care of it. He didn't take care of it, did he? He left it covered with loose boards, and 3 days later, exactly what you warned him about happened. An adult fell in and died. Rebecca tried to recover on cross-examination. Dr. Chen, you sent that email on a Thursday. Mrs. Weinstein died on Tuesday night, 5 days later, not 3. In those 5 days, did Mr. Morrison have a reasonable opportunity to install a platform? I don't know his schedule. He worked full-time from home. He'd just been through a criminal investigation for the harassment. He was dealing with constant trespassing and vandalism. Is it reasonable to expect him to drop everything and install a platform in 5 days? Reasonable or not, the hazard was severe enough to warrant immediate action. Immediate meaning what? Same day? Next day? Within a week? Within a few days. Professional archaeologists don't leave exposed wells unsecured for long because the liability is too great. Mr. Morrison isn't a professional archaeologist. He's a homeowner who made a historical discovery. Should he have acted faster? Maybe. But does failing to install a platform in 5 days constitute reckless disregard for human life when the person who died was committing a crime by being on his property? Dr. Chen looked at Jake, and he saw genuine sympathy in her eyes. I don't know. That's for the jury to decide. It wasn't the answer Rebecca wanted, but it was honest. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Jake spent the time in a rental apartment he'd moved into after the latest round of vandalism made his house unlivable. The oak tree had been poisoned. Someone had drilled holes in the trunk and injected herbicide. The arborist said it would probably survive, but it would take years to recover. Everything in his life was damaged, wounded, struggling to survive. On the 3rd day, the verdict came in. The jury found in favor of Jake Morrison. No negligence, no wrongful death. David Weinstein's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The jury also issued a statement, unusual in civil cases, expressing their view that while Jake wasn't legally responsible for Carol's death, he could have done more to prevent it. They recommended that local laws be changed to require immediate professional securing of any excavated wells or similar hazards, regardless of how they were discovered. You won, Rebecca told him over drinks that evening. You're not liable. You don't owe them anything. Feel like I lost everything anyway. Then sell the house, move on, start over somewhere else. Jake looked at his phone. The realtor he'd contacted had sent a preliminary assessment. Given the house's reputation, the publicized vandalism, and the death occurred here disclosure requirements, he'd be lucky to get 60% of what he'd paid for it. He'd lose over $150,000 on the sale. I can't afford to sell, he said. The legal fees, the repairs, the lost value, I'd be financially ruined. You're stuck there. I'm stuck there. Rebecca shook her head. I've been practicing law for 30 years. I've seen people destroy each other over property lines, tree branches, parking spaces, but I've never seen anything this toxic. You should write a book. Call it How an HOA Destroyed My Life. Jake laughed bitterly. Who'd read it? Everyone who's been through HOA hell already knows the story. Everyone else thinks we're just whining about minor inconveniences. Maybe, but this case is going to change things. There are already 3 bills in the state legislature about HOA reform. Limits on enforcement powers, mandatory arbitration before fines, protection for historical features. Carol Weinstein's death is going to have a legacy. That's nice for future homeowners. Doesn't help me. They drank in silence for a while. Finally, Rebecca said, What are you going to do? I don't know. Go home, I guess. Try to live in a neighborhood that hates me. Hope they eventually forget. They won't forget. I know. Jake moved back into his house 2 weeks later. He'd installed new security cameras, reinforced his fences, and planted bamboo along the property line to create a visual barrier. He was building a fortress, exactly what he'd told Carol he shouldn't have to do. The first HOA meeting after his return was called to order by David Weinstein, who'd retained his position as president despite the lawsuit loss. Jake attended, sitting in the back row, saying nothing. David addressed the room like a general rallying troops. "We've been through a difficult time. Our community has been divided. Our property values have been affected, all because one man refused to follow the rules that keep us safe, prosperous, and unified." Was acquitted, someone called out. "Richard's still fighting. Acquitted of criminal charges on a technicality," David said. "The civil jury's statement was clear. He could have prevented my wife's death. He chose not to, and now we have to decide what kind of community we want to be. Do we want to be a place where people can flout our standards, create hazards, and face no consequences? Or do we want to maintain the excellence that Carol spent years building?" The vote was 78-12 in favor of stricter enforcement. New rules were passed. Any historical features discovered on property must be reported to the HOA within 24 hours. All hazards must be professionally secured within 48 hours, or the homeowner faces immediate fines. Trees over 50 years old near property lines require annual safety inspections at homeowner expense. Security cameras facing neighboring properties are prohibited. Bamboo plantings are classified as invasive species and prohibited. Every single rule targeted Jake specifically. "This is harassment," Jake said, standing up. All eyes turned to him. "You're writing rules specifically designed to punish me for being found not guilty." "These rules apply to everyone," David said smoothly. "If they disproportionately affect you, perhaps that says something about your property maintenance. My property was fine until your wife started vandalizing it." Room erupted. Neighbors shouting at each other, years of resentment and division boiling over. David banged the gavel until his hand must have hurt. "Mr. Morrison, you're out of order. Leave this meeting immediately or I'll call the police." "What, speaking at a community meeting?" "For disturbing the peace, for creating a hostile environment, for violating the decorum standards outlined in Section 23, Paragraph 8 of our bylaws." Jake looked around the room, some faces sympathetic, most hostile. All tired of the conflict, he left, walking home through the perfect streets with their perfect lawns. Jake realized what he should have understood months ago. This was never about a fence or a tree or even Carol's death. This was about power, about a community that had built its identity on control and uniformity, and one man who challenged that identity just by existing differently. He couldn't win. Not really. Even with 2 trial victories, even with the law on his side, he couldn't win because the law couldn't change the fundamental social dynamics of a place that valued conformity over everything else. The oak tree stood in his backyard, wounded but alive, a survivor of Carol's spray paint and someone's poison, and 150 years of human development. But Jake wasn't an oak tree. He was just a man, tired and financially broken and utterly alone. He sat under the tree that night and made his decision. The "for sale" sign went up on a Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, David Weinstein had filed a complaint claiming the sign violated HOA regulations about size, placement, and advance notice. The regulations he cited had been written the previous week. Jake's realtor, a tough woman named Patricia who dealt with difficult sales before, was incredulous. "They're trying to prevent you from selling. They want me to suffer here. Leaving would be escape. They can't allow that. That's insane. Welcome to HOA life." Legal battle over the "for sale" sign took 6 weeks and cost Jake another $12,000 in legal fees. He won, but the victory was meaningless because by then, every potential buyer had researched the property and found the news stories, the court transcripts, the true crime podcast episodes, the neighborhood reviews warning that Maple Ridge Estates was toxic and divided and run by a grieving tyrant. 3 buyers made offers. All withdrew after attending the HOA meetings where David Weinstein detailed the tragic history of the property and the ongoing compliance issues that any new owner would inherit. "He's torpedoing your sale," Patricia said. "Deliberately. We sue? For what? Free speech. He's just providing information to potential buyers. Biased, inflammatory information, but information nonetheless." Jake dropped the price by $100,000, then another $50,000. Finally, an investor made an offer, a cash offer at 50% of the original value. He was going to turn it into a rental property and didn't care about the neighborhood drama. Jake accepted. He'd lose nearly $200,000 on the sale. His savings were gone. His credit cards were maxed out. He'd have to start over with nothing in a new city with a legal history that would follow him forever. But he'd be free. The closing was scheduled for March 15th. Jake spent the final weeks packing up his life, dividing it into boxes labeled keep, donate, and trash. Most of Sarah's things went to charity, most of his went to trash. He was burning it all down, starting from zero. Richard came over on the last night. They sat under the oak tree, which was showing signs of recovery, new growth sprouting from branches that had looked dead. "Where will you go?" Richard asked. "Portland. Back where I came from. Start over. Try to forget this year ever happened." "You can't forget, but maybe you can learn from it." "Learn what?" "That some people are so broken they'll destroy everything around them trying to maintain control. I already knew that." Richard shook his head. "Learn that systems matter, that good intentions can create terrible structures, that HOAs started as a way to protect property values and build community, but they've become something else, something that gives petty tyrants a kingdom and reasonable people ulcers." "What's the answer?" "I don't know. Reform maybe, limits on power, mandatory sunset clauses on rules, independent arbitration, or maybe just dismantling them entirely and trusting people to be good neighbors without the threat of fines." They sat in silence, listening to the wind in the oak's branches. "Sorry," Richard said finally. "I'm sorry I didn't fight harder for you. I should have stood up to Carol more, should have opposed David's election, should have." "You did what you could." "Most people did nothing. That's not a comfort. But it's reality." Richard left around midnight. Jake stayed under the tree until dawn, saying goodbye to Sarah's memory, to the hope he'd had when he bought this place, to the idea that peace was possible. The sun rose over Maple Ridge Estates, illuminating perfect lawns and perfect houses and perfect lives built on foundations of rigid rules and suppressed conflicts, and the kind of desperate control that turns neighbors into enemies. Jake Morrison was leaving, but the system that had destroyed him remained, waiting for the next person who didn't quite fit, who challenged the standards, who dared to be different. The well was sealed now, marked with a plaque that tourists occasionally came to see. Historic well, circa 1890s. Site of the 2024 Maple Ridge tragedy. They'd made Carol Weinstein's death part of the historical record, her obsession immortalized in bronze and stone. But Jake knew the real history, the one that wouldn't be written on plaques, the story